So the first thing we're going to configure would be the config server replica sets, or the CSRS servers. So let me start that now. And I'm first going to SSH into the CSRS A server. So we'll have to set up both A and B. We're just going to start with A. So here I am at CSRS A. And what I have to do is I need to edit the MongoDB config file. So I hope you still remember where that is. It's in the etc. directory. And then here, I have to change the port from 27017 to 27019. 27019 is the default port for the config server. That's why we have to use 27019. Next, we need to set up replication and sharding configurations. For the replication configuration, we have to give it a replica set name. So this is the name, the label you are going to give the replica set of config servers. So these two config servers here need to have a label. So the config servers here will be labeled CSRS. So this is not a required name. This is an arbitrary label. I'm just calling it CSRS for standardization purposes. Next, I'm going to give this a cluster role. And the cluster role we are going to give it is config server. So we are giving this config server the role of config server so that the MongoDB cluster knows that this is meant to be a config server. I'm going to save and exit that config server configuration file, and I'm going to SSH to my second database or my second server as well. And here I am going to do the same thing. This is config server replica set B. So config server replica set B is going to be part of the replica set. So the data will be replicated across A and B. Again, the data stored in this config server replica set is actually metadata for the cluster, meaning the location of all of the shards and the data in each of the shards. So I'm going to, again, give it the same replica set name. It has to have the same replica set name as config server A because they are replicating to each other. So the replica set name is the name of the group, which is why it has to be the same. For sharding, I'm going to give it a cluster role. And this cluster role will again be config server. So again, we made all of the changes. We have port 27019. We have the replica set name. And then we have the cluster role. Now we have to reset the MongoDB server. So I'm going to reset it here on config server B. And I'm going to reset it as well on config server A. So again, I'm just using systemctl to reset the server. Now we can check if it's running properly if we check the open ports on this machine. And you can see that both of them are running MongoDB on port 27019, which is a default port for your config server replica sets. Now we need to initialize the replica set. And the instructions to initialize the replica set are in this document. So you can see here, this is the command I need to run from the Mongo shell to initialize the replica set. So I'm going to connect to the Mongo shell. And I am going to now initiate my replica set. I will need the IP address of both A and B. And I have to specify that this is a config server. This is very important that we are setting the value of config server to true. Now I'm just going to copy the internal IP addresses and include it in this replica set. And then I'm going to initiate my replica set. And now you can see the replica set has been initiated. Now, normally in real life, you would have an odd number of replica sets because you want to achieve quorum. Because we are using an even number for resource purposes, we will have to wait a while before they sync. So you can see that there is a primary. Let me just expand this. There is a primary server and there is a secondary server. And they actually have not been able to sync successfully yet. If there were an odd number, it would actually sync more quickly. But eventually, if you get to this point, it should be able to sync successfully already because we can check when we initiated the replica set, it actually replied with OK. So you can see there is an OK in the reply. It will just take some time for them to sync to one another, and that should be fine. You should still be able to proceed with the sharding, even if they're in the process of syncing.